wife. She had always been the perfect wife. Immaculately turned out, polite, every meal cooked on time. She was the perfect host. But everyone knows no one is perfect. Unfortunately, her husband James had forgotten this, and he had begun to take his wife Anne for granted. He expected his bed made, shirts ironed, the house cleaned, everything spick and span. That morning he set off to work as usual. Everything was ready and in place like clockwork. He kissed Anne goodbye and walked to his office. Each day was the same, and it was just the way he liked it. He loved routine. He loved order, not chaos. He was boring. He worked on the till at the local supermarket, but he acted as if he was in charge of a nuclear submarine. 9 till 5 every day, regular as clockwork. All of the customers knew him by name. Good morning, John, they'd say, and it was. He loved his wife. She was always there for him. They had met at the local dance 20 years before, and he'd been struck by her quiet nature, and he'd never looked at another woman since. He was too busy. He was content with his lot, as he had every reason to be. A lot of people his age were going through messy divorces and money worries. He was confident that this would never happen to him. He was the perfect husband, polite, punctual, and faithful, and she was the perfect wife, so he thought. James handed the I keep forgetting his name. John handed the receipt to the customer, ready to serve another. He didn't mind, they were all the same to him. They kept him in work, and he was grateful. Anne was bored. She was so bored that she thought she would scream. She'd had enough of her life, and she couldn't take it any more. She wanted excitement, adventure, and passion, everything that she didn't have. As soon as James was out of sight, hello, customer, she appeared through the curtains at the red sports car that was parked outside, and her heart leapt. The driver was dressed as usual in a black suit with slick black hair. He was Italian, like a young Sylvester Stallone. Fit, funny, and fabulous, she thought. After 20 years of boredom, her feelings of guilt had evaporated, and now she just didn't care. She needed fun, and she knew how to get it. She let him in and hoped none of the neighbors would notice the flashy car outside. She knew she was being careless, but she was too much in lust and love to think straight. As soon as he entered, they were kissing each other. It was an instant attraction they couldn't control. For over 3 months now it had been going on. They couldn't stop. They were like a runaway train. John didn't expect anything. He always told friends that he trusted her completely. But what he didn't know was, like the law, trust was often broken. They lay in bed together making plans. I can't stand this boring marriage any longer, she complained. He was sympathetic. You can live with me, he said, kissing her, and then adding, I have a nice big house for us to get lost in. She laughed and kissed him again, like a teenager. After another half hour's fumbling about, they got dressed, and John kissed her goodbye at the door. And then he drove off at speed, secure in the knowledge that they'd be together soon. Anne watched him leave, peering through the net curtains. Then she headed into the kitchen for a glass of water. She had a terrible headache and needed to lay down. For the next few days she was in turmoil about what to do. Could she handle going through a messy divorce and public shame? Could she admit to the affair? All of these thoughts swirled around, making her dizzy. As she lay on the bed, Tommy, her favourite cat, padded over to her and cuddled up to her. She remembered that he hadn't been fed, and she roused herself and went to the kitchen, and she looked in the cupboards, moving a few tins around. It was then that she saw it, rat poison. It had been there for years, and she'd forgotten about it. She fed Tommy and went back to bed. There was a dull thumping in the back of her head, as if someone had struck her with a heavy implement. Anne decided to sleep. She only had a few hours before John came back, her husband, and had dinner to prepare. She wasn't in the mood, and as she stroked Tommy, she pondered her options. The more she thought about it, the more appealing it seemed. All she had to do was sprinkle a little rat poison in with his spaghetti bolognese like pepper, and wait for it to take effect. She wasn't sure how much to use, so she decided to experiment. She almost laughed. She was enjoying herself. More and more it seemed that she had few options. She had to get out of this boring marriage. With trepidation she sprinkled it lightly over the bubbling spaghetti bolognese, and it dissolved with each turn of the wooden spoon. She was careful not to use too much. She didn't want to spoil the taste and be found out. She slowly swirled the spoon around with a satisfied look on her face until a creeping realization came to her. How could she avoid eating the fateful meal herself? In her haste and excitement, the obvious had been obscured. She wouldn't have to say she didn't feel well and decline the meal. It wouldn't be a problem, as her husband was kind and considerate, she thought, without a hint of guilt. She couldn't wait for him to come home, and so she busied herself by polishing and dusting. She needed to keep up a pretense of normalcy. On the dot, he arrived home and hung his coat and hat on the stand and went into the living room to kiss his wife. Had a good day, dear? She asked, feigning interest. Oh, yes, he replied. It was marvellous. How marvellous it was till all day long doing monotonous tasks was beyond her comprehension. Beatles, Elvis, Pink Floyd. What's for dinner, darling? Please sub me. Spaghetti bolognese, she said, and it's ready now. He sat at the dining table and she carried the piping hot meal on a tray. It smelled delicious. He could feel his stomach rumble. He was so hungry that he knew he was going to eat a large portion. She scooped the spaghetti onto his plate but left her plate empty. Reef Davis. Aren't you hungry, dear? She asked, concerned. No, she replied. I've got a terrible headache and I think I'll just stick to bread and water. Bye-bye. And she put her hand to her head for effect, but the funny thing was she wasn't kidding. Please sub me. She watched him twist and scoop the spaghetti into his mouth. She was fascinated and a little on edge, waiting for his verdict. It's delicious, he said, as the hot sauce dripped down his well-shaven chin. You forgot your pepper, dear, she said, and he grunted as she lightly sprinkled his meal, covering up the bitter taste of the rat poison. Bye-bye. Within 5 minutes he'd cleaned his plate and sat back satisfied. Well, dear, I'm stuffed, he said, smiling and mopping the sauce from his mouth. By now her head was throbbing and it was hard for her not to wince in pain. Are you all right, love? He asked, concerned. Oh, it's just this terrible headache, she said. It started this morning and it just seems to be getting worse. She winced, taking another sip of water. I'm sure it will be gone by the evening, she added. The last thing she wanted was to worry her husband. Soon she'd be riding off into the sunset with her lover, and all of the drudgery would be behind her. I think I'll lay on the couch, said her husband. He plunked himself down in front of the TV as usual. She filled her glass and decided to sit across from him. She didn't want to arouse suspicion. It was hard for her to concentrate on the mindless programs. He was so engrossing. Gross the operative word, she thought. Each time that he laughed loudly, she could feel her brain rattle like marbles in a jar. The pain was excruciating. It must be the stress, she thought. How long will it take to work, she thought, getting more and more worried as she stomped off to the kitchen for more water. At this rate, I'll drown, she thought. As she walked back to the living room, she noticed that his laughing had ceased, and as she stepped inside, she saw her husband on his hands and knees. He was foaming at the mouth and his eyes were red and bulging, looking almost rat-like, she thought, with a touch of humour. He turned towards her with outstretched arms, with more foam coming out of his mouth. She was pleased that he couldn't speak, and she sipped water and waited for the inevitable. Not long now, she said, and turned off the TV. Her head was still throbbing, but her heartbeat was beat with hope and excitement. She stepped over her motionless husband and rang her favourite number, her lover's. It's done, she said, and she didn't have to explain. It was now time to put the next stage of the plan into operation. I'm on my way, he said. We can bundle him into the boot, bury him in the woods. I love you, she said, and she smiled, thinking of the bright future that was opening up for them. It was then that the headache struck with deadly force like an ice pick. It wasn't a headache, it was an embolism, and she gasped and fell onto the floor, dead as a dodo, leaving the phone ringing and her lover's concerned voice hanging in the air. A week later, husband and wife were together again in the cemetery. The police put the death down to misadventure. They had enough paperwork to contend with, and they didn't need the hassle or the publicity. John stayed away. He had a date, and he was just thankful that he had never tasted her cooking. The rain fell over the cemetery and ran down their headstone, where they lay together for eternity. They were the perfect couple in life and in death. Hope you enjoyed that story. Please sub me.